morning, everybody. Thank you, Chair. This title of my presentation was proposed by IFPRI to me, so I fit my presentation to the title given to me. I have a long I have a long experience working in the DRC. I was a professor there for 7 years and have done a lot of missions and still go there from time to time. The DRC, of course, is a huge country. I think it's the largest country now in area in Africa. I mean, 48% of the water in Africa falls on the DRC. 70 million people. Large cities. Kinshasa is over 10 million. Lubumbashi is now 5 million. And it's a country, many consider the DRC as a failed state, but they face chronic humanitarian crisis, and they're still out of protracted conflict in Central Africa. And the eastern DRC, I mean the Kivus and Ituri, is still not fully pacified. And I think, well, there are 20,000 United Nations troops in the country. This costs $1.3 billion per year. It's the largest UN operation in terms of peacekeeping, peacemaking in the world. They have 50 planes flying under the United Nations flag in the DRC. It's a huge operation. The political transition coming out of basically conflict, coming out of also of the partition of the country was 2003, 2006 with the transition government towards democratic elections, and this all went fairly well. So since 2006, there is a democratically elected government in place, but doesn't mean that everything is pacified. You will still have pockets of resistance. There are at least still 5 rebel groups roaming in the east of the country, and I think it will be unrealistic to expect that in a large country with a big ethnic diversity like the DRC, that everything will be peaceful everywhere. I think there will obviously be pockets somewhere. And this has, of course, to do with the presence of a lot of resources, especially minerals. The Congolese themselves are proud to say that God put the whole table of Mendeleev in their country. So, and also land rights are now emerging, and especially in the more densely populated areas in the east of the country, you have a lot of land conflicts. And conflicts between pastoral people and agricultural people. And, of course, conflicts about mineral rights. So, what happened during and after the political transition? Well, there was great optimism. I mean, in 2006, with the first democratic elections, for the first time, a democratically elected government in basically, well, 30 years, because the whole Mobutu regime was basically a dictatorship. So donors were very generous in giving, especially short-term emergency and humanitarian aid. And most of the important donors existing in the world are in the DRC and giving emergency aid, humanitarian aid. And the characteristic is that when you give humanitarian emergency aid, there are basically no conditionalities imposed during the transitions. And many donors preferred multilateral UN institutions. After the transition, starting in 2006, well, that was the whole issue of transition between emergency humanitarian aid and longer-term development aid. And that's difficult, because when you start having normal development aid, you have some conditionalities, like the government must participate, must co-finance, and most donors have some conditionalities. And this didn't work very well. So you still have a lot of emergency humanitarian aid, and the right mix of both is difficult. Most of the migration in the country is internal displacement. There are still an estimated 1.7 million internally displaced people in the country. This is 2012. And recently there has been a large influx of migrants from the Central African Republic. I mean, more than 100,000 people are in the north of the country as migrants coming from the Central African Republic. So coming out of conflict and political transition, well, it's maybe surprising, but agriculture and food security are not priority issues. They're not really on the table of the government. In fact, you can say that agriculture is grossly neglected. Less than 2% of the government budget going to agriculture. And they signed the Maputo Agreement in 2011 to go to 10% of the government budget. And the government budget is small. Make no mistake about that. 2014, the government budget is just $8 billion. $4 billion their own fiscal revenue, and $4 billion from basically donors. Of the 2% government budget actually voted by the parliament, only about half is actually released, is spent. So, I remember 2012, the operating budget, the Ministry of Agriculture was $50 million, and the World Food Programme had a program of $250 million, 5 times larger, to say that this is, this is not normal. Well, so most agricultural support is provided by donors. I mean, if you are government officials, why are you spending so little on agriculture? Oh, but that's where we get donor money. Donors will easily give funding for agriculture. Now, the security situation, consolidating the state, the army, justice, consolidating the democratic processes, these are the priorities of the government. I mean, not agriculture. And the institutions remain weak. I mean, there's chronic state failure. Many people say failed state, but the Congolese don't like that, of course. Lack of tradition is a very big issue. I mean, don't know how to do things properly because they have never done it. There's no tradition in the country. Food imports are very large. They're about, I think now, in 2014, they're expected to be about $1.5 billion. Surprisingly, there's no foreign exchange constraint. Because of the importance of the mining sector. I mean, Congo is now, again, the second largest copper producer in Africa. 1 million tons of copper. They are the largest producer of coltan, and also of cobalt in the world. So there's not really a foreign exchange constraint. I mean, that's not a problem. So they can import massive food quantities. And in fact, if you look at the economy of the DRC, it has many of the characteristics of an oil exporter, of a big oil country, like Gabon, or even their neighbor Congo-Brazzaville, or Angola, because of minerals and oil exports. Oil exports are growing very rapidly. I mean, 20% of the government budget now comes from offshore oil and so that's increasing rapidly. Food imports is basically very cheap, bulky, low-quality food, calorie-rich, cereals, animal proteins, fats. Cheap kappa meat means the 4/4 of beef. Beef mainly coming from India, buffalo meat, offals, layered chickens, etc. Old stocks of rice and wheat. Nutrition. Nutrition is not seen as a priority. I remember we had an IFPRI conference in 2011 in Congo, and nutrition never came up. I mean, Joachim van Braun told me, Eric, this is my main surprise here is that a country which has such poor nutrition, I mean, 70% of the people are classified by WHO, FAO as chronically food insecure. I mean, stunting and wasting of children is a huge problem. The DRC has some of the world's statistics in this area. But, when you have a conference on food security and agriculture, nutrition does not come up as an issue. I mean, filling your stomach, having enough calories, that's the main consideration. Now, in agriculture, quick gains still dominate the agenda. Improved seed, hand tools, tractors. The Congolese government is importing large amount of tractors. And this is very surprising. Of course, this is an easy thing to do because you give them away and you buy political alliances, but tractors are not what they should be doing. It's extension, it's the rural infrastructure, it's irrigation, it's roads. I mean, it's so many other things. I mean, rural feeder roads rehabilitation and the maintenance of those roads is a huge challenge, and it absorbs large amounts of donor aid. Agricultural statistics are totally neglected. The Congolese themselves, you don't eat statistics. So the world's hunger and nutrition indicators do not raise political alarms. I mean, those indicators come from abroad, and they are not on the political agenda. So also export crops is not a priority because they require more longer-term investments, and they're in fact neglected. Private sector investments in export crops, despite the huge potential. I mean, at one time, the DRC was the largest exporter of palm oil in the world. Now they import more than 100,000 tons of palm oil. So export crops, the Doing business index of the World Bank in the DRC is again one of the worst in the world, so the investment climate is poor and lack of infrastructure. The rainforest is a big consideration, of course. Many donors finance projects on REDD+. In conclusion, I know my time is up. Well, the Congo faces one of the worst and the most complex problems in terms of conflict, with the protracted humanitarian crisis, and especially in the east and the northeast in the country, chronic vulnerability, recurring shocks, especially because of conflict and minerals, epidemics, think about Ebola, acute malnutrition. I mean, the country is subject to so many shocks. So building community resilience is a huge challenge. And how do you do that? You know, capacity building for community resilience. How do you do? What are the best practices? I mean, this is the main question, you know.
Thank you, Eric. Then,
okay. So link
very
between,
rich
just one thing, link
presentation.
between humanitarian and development sectors. That's how you do that. How from a humanitarian to development. Okay.
You know, professors never behave. I'm a professor myself, so.